Today we're going to start off in Seattle, my dog, where Pete Carroll just addressed his decision not to sign Colin Kaepernick back in 2017. Carroll met with Cap right after he and the 49ers parted ways, and now the coach says he wishes he had given the quarterback a chance. Mark, are you buying Pete Carroll here?
I am buying Pete Carroll. I mean, I think one thing about the Seattle Seahawks is it is a situation. When you go to their practice, it is open, it is competitive, it is one of those things. I think that he really believes that, he thought Colin Kaepernick deserved an opportunity. He wasn't going to get an opportunity to be a starter, obviously, because of Russell Wilson, how great Russell Wilson is. I think that's a large part of it. So I do buy that part of it. I think there's more to it than that, though. I mean, I don't think that's the whole story. Obviously, when you bring Colin Kaepernick in that situation, I mean, that's a guy that has been a starter. There's a lot of questions. You open your starting quarterback up to those questions. You open him up to press conferences. You open your team up to having to answer questions. And, continuity and not having those things in your locker room or not having to have your players address those things, I think is a big part of managing your football team. So I don't think that's the only reason that he wasn't going to get to compete for a starting job. I don't think that was the only reason. But I do believe that Pete Carroll is sincere when he said, I don't want to bring him into that situation, because I do feel at that point, that was years ago, that he was still a starting quality quarterback.
I got to be real about this. This story is impossible to buy on its surface. It's just not plausible. Like, if you follow all of the comments, it just actually tangles you up in a spider web of issues. I take you back to something my grandmother used to always tell me. She used to say that the truth is simple and lies are complex. There's a reason why this story is pretty complex. It's because something is not being told here. So there's always been this fascination for me for Pete Carroll and his mantra of always competing. And I love the guy, and he has so much emotional latitude, and he gives his guys the freedom to be who they are. But let's not forget, as glowing as I am about Pete Carroll, there's a good Pete Carroll, and there's not so good Pete Carroll. The good Pete Carroll may be right now holding a grenade, actually not trying to say exactly the truth in this situation. Maybe they did offer Colin Kaepernick a backup situation and he turned it down. Whatever it is, there's something that he's holding that he's not letting go and disclosing. Now, the not so good Pete Carroll is the same guy who left all those youngsters and kids on the hook when USC was going down in flames and took $35 million and took a flight to Seattle and became the head coach, let that program go down. So in that situation, you look at this through those lenses and start to analyze what Pete Carroll is saying, you start to realize that, hold on, Pete, you had Russell Wilson and you bring in Colin Kaepernick, and after a great meeting with Colin Kaepernick, you come to the realization that he's a starter in this league? How is he not a starter in this league if he's on your roster? He's a backup on your team. So why bring someone in who's a starter unless you're thinking of them as a backup? A couple years ago, Pete Carroll comes out and says this. You know what? It got blown out of proportion, Colin Kaepernick and us discussing the protests. He said it got blown out of proportion. Yesterday, he said it wasn't true. That was never discussed. Which one is it? When you look at it from a pure football perspective, you're looking at a roster where they're going to run it back with Geno Smith as their backup. And what, Austin Davis and the undrafted guys back in the days who are now coaches? Like, they need to upgrade their roster at the backup position. And I think they brought Kaepernick in for that. But somehow, some way, they got to a place where they didn't want that to happen anymore. I wish Pete Carroll would just admit that, and then we can move forward.
I think that's some valid explanations right there, Marcellus, to be honest. It makes me think about it. I am buying the story. And the reason why I'm buying it is based upon the fact that he didn't have to respond to begin with. I will say this, and in all sincerity, I believe Pete Carroll is using this as an opportunity to clear his own name as it applies to the 2020 hindsight of how Kaepernick was treated. And maybe this is that moment for him to be able to say, let me straighten up the story as it applied to me, as it applied to our team and organization. But he didn't have to say anything at all. And looking at it from just a face value, if he wasn't going to be sincere or genuine to a certain degree, whether some of the things you're saying are correct, whether some of the quotes that he made may not actually match up, he did not have to engage the conversation. Pete is well established enough, well respected enough, and smart enough to know that the minute he spoke on this Kaepernick situation, the climate that we're currently sitting in right now, it was going to become a headline. It's going to be on Speak for Yourself today and numerous other TV shows where they're going to dissect and really break down what it is that Pete Carroll may have been saying or may not have been saying. So I think by him knowing that and being clear on that, there is a level of genuineness and sincerity in the words that he's saying. But I agree. I think the rabbit hole definitely goes a little deeper, and I think there's probably other agendas or reasons for him doing it. But the one that I settled on was I just want to separate myself from any ill feelings in terms of how this man was treated based upon a change of feelings that people had 3 years later.
Yeah, I would say this. I mean, how many different organizations did Colin Kaepernick even get to go in and work out for? Pete Carroll is one of those organizations. And, you know, most of the time, even when we're answering questions as former players and we're answering questions, we answer the question the way we want to answer the question. Not necessarily what the reporter is digging for, but the way you want to shape the narrative, right? And you're very versed in that as a head coach or as a player based upon the narrative that you want to be out there. And I think there's always more to the story. You know, when it's come to a head coach, there's a lot of decisions and a lot of things that you have to think about when you're managing your football team. And I think that's what Pete Carroll said is, hey, listen, man, we brought him in. We're one of the teams, one of the few teams that brought him in. We worked him out. We really liked him. But there wasn't a spot because we looked at him as like, hey, we don't want you to compete with our starting quarterback. Our starting quarterback is established. He doesn't miss games, whatever the case may be. And ultimately, we'll give you an opportunity to go out there and find your starting job, or at least give you a chance to compete for your starting job. The other thing is there is noise. There are things that people are going to have to answer and talk about, and I don't want to bring that into my organization. And that is perfectly acceptable. Like when you're managing a football team, it's like the Tim Tebow scenario. Like there's a lot of teams that didn't want to bring Tim Tebow in. I think Tim Tebow is a good football player. I don't think he's a quarterback, but I think he's a good football player. But there are a lot of teams that say, I don't want to have, you know, a press conference for my backup quarterback. That's a distraction. And you know as well as I do, teams really worry about the distraction during the course of the season. And that's part of the decision-making process that goes into being an organization, a head coach, you know, in a football team. So, I don't fault Pete Carroll. I look at Pete Carroll, and I have a lot of respect for him.
I got a ton of respect for Pete Carroll, but I never had Seattle as an intended target in terms of all of the shrapnel and all of the consequences that have come from Kaepernick being unemployed and blackballed. I thought Seattle actually was one of the teams that really put forth effort until I heard him yesterday. And then I was like, wait a minute. You have now talked yourself into the crossfire. And the cover-up sounds worse than the crime. Like, if we're starting to really untangle what Pete Carroll is saying, he's basically saying, I love the guy. He's a starter. And we had Russell Wilson, so we brought him in. If you brought him in and you already got a starter, what'd you bring him in for? A backup. Okay, where's the offer? If you can get Colin Kaepernick to even bite at any offer, you've done something there, because who doesn't want to stack the deck in terms of backups, in terms of talent on the roster? But no, we'd rather go forward with Geno Smith. What? What are you saying right here? So that makes no sense in a football perspective. And I'm with Pete Carroll. Look, I'm going to keep it 100. Pete Carroll's a white coach, and we're asking him right now in this moment how he felt about Colin Kaepernick back then and right now. Like many a person, they have a change in tune. And that's okay. It's fine. But you have to either know how to dance with this conversation with sophistication or stay out of this conversation because people will pick up on your issues, the discrepancies, and they're all glaring right now. Since 2018, 18 quarterbacks by the names of like C.J. Beathard and Ryan Finley, Will Greer, all of them have went out there and started a combined 71 games. You know how many of those games they won? 7. You're trying to tell me that this is not just league-wide, but Seattle didn't think that maybe we put ourselves in a position where one day if Russell Wilson ever gets hurt, which he never does, we need someone a little more capable in the backup position. I really think he did himself a disservice by stepping in this and not being genuine. That's where I am with Pete Carroll. No love lost. Just keep it 100.